So I'm just going to give an informal talk. I'm going to talk my way through the handout, and it's 9:33, so I will stop at 10:03 no matter what, and if I haven't finished, too bad. As everybody knows, the notes that were selected from Wittgenstein's Nachlass by Asker and von Richt arose out of discussions with Norman Malcolm of Moore's papers, Defense of Common Sense from 1921 and Proof of an External World from 1939. In the first paper, let me just say this one en passant remark, which I'm happy to talk about in Q&A if anyone's interested. In the contemporary literature, Moore is assumed to be answering skepticism. It's completely bizarre things, as Moore says in so many words in response to his critics in the Library of Living Philosophers volume, that he's not answering the skeptic. That he is often distinguished, he says, two propositions. One is there are no external things, which some philosophers have held. And another is no one knows for certain that there are external things, which many more philosophers have held. And then Moore says, I have never thought that the second set of philosophers could be answered with so simple a proof as I gave in this paper. Moore lists a certain, in defense, he lists a certain number of banal propositions. I have a body, I've never been very far from the earth, which he, and thinks everybody else, knows with certainty to be true. In fact, you probably noticed he uses this phrase that rarely occurs in contemporary epistemology. He says, wholly true. This, of course, indicates that Moore's initial target is not skepticism, but British idealism, because perhaps the most famous doctrine of F.H. Bradley was the doctrine of degrees of truth, and that no ordinary sentence, as ordinarily meant, is ever more than a partial truth, Bradley's view. The other target, by the way, is Russell, who thought that common sense could be replaced with more logically respectable ways of talking and involving inconvenient but philosophically much superior logical constructions, and that's another thing that Moore doesn't, of course, name either philosopher, so it's left as an exercise to the reader to see who's getting it. He's similarly confident, as I say here, with respect to the premise of his argument in Proof, where Moore, while making a gesture, announces here is one hand and here is another. The gesture is, I think, essential to the proof, although again, more or less entirely ignored in modern contemporary discussions of Moore and skepticism. I blame Fred Dretsky for bringing up the issue of epistemic closure, which is a complete red herring, and as he's been arguing for 30 years or more, has nothing whatsoever to do with skepticism, even though people, including, I'll speak at the date Duncan Pritchard, think it's some kind of big deal. It's no deal. I'm happy to talk about that if anybody wants to know. Now, the very first sentence of the notes that we have as uncertainty is, if you do know that here is one hand, we'll grant you all the rest. Now, I think we can all agree that Wittgenstein does not grant him all the rest. It's at least up for grabs whether he grants Moore any of the rest. We can be absolutely certain that there's something wrong with Moore's claim to know that here is one hand. So Moore in some way has gone wrong. And Wittgenstein thinks that Moore has put his finger on, I think, an interesting phenomenon, but then completely failed to understand it. And the interesting thing is that although Moore is utterly confident in his claims to know, he candidly admits in Proof that he cannot prove that he knows. In fact, he can't in any way explain how he knows. And that's the interesting phenomenon, that these propositions that he's utterly certain that he knows, and at the same time candidly admits that he cannot explain how he knows, or at least cannot do so to the satisfaction of a skeptic or some other philosophers who are opposed to common sense. So how has More gone wrong? Well, I think there are two possibilities. One which everybody believes, I think, or accepts. And it's this, that More's knowledge claims are simply false. His propositions are certainties of a special kind. Exactly what kind is much disputed. There are many different versions of, say, Hinge epistemology. Not a single view, it's a research program. But they're not things that he knows. This is something that's agreed on all hands. He doesn't know. It's just wrong to say that. They're not knowledge, they're something very distinct from knowledge. But there's another possibility, which, as far as I know, I'm the only person who defends it. Maybe there are others, because I'm not really up on the literature. It's that More's claiming to know these things in the situation in which he makes the claims is in some important way infelicitous, and perhaps even in some sense nonsensical. I liked the word Hanyo introduced yesterday, that one cannot, as it were, sensefully say, I know certain things, even when you do know them. And I think Wittgenstein, and I'm going to defend this and say that More's deep mistake is something quite other than anything that is discussed in Hinge epistemology. And he's not the only one to have made it. Many philosophers of his generation also made it. Wittgenstein, and I come back to this, makes a remark quite early when he says that we just do not see how very specialized the use of I know is. Wittgenstein thinks of explicit knowledge claims as very specialized. And I think he's sniffing around what's today referred to as the knowledge rule of assertion. Although not in any very technical way. The thought is that we don't normally express knowledge by saying I know. We normally express knowledge in a serious communicative situation where people need information by saying things that we know, just by unqualified assertion. I mean, in ordinary language, if you don't know, you're supposed to warn, well, I think, or I've seen some evidence that, or something like that. But if you say to me, what time does the train to New York leave? And I say, oh, it's 3:10. And it's quite important that you get there. So you might say to me, well, how do you know? That's an interesting phenomenon. I mean, I didn't say that I knew. I just told you when the train leaves. And suppose though it doesn't leave at 3:10, then you upbraid me. And I say, well, I didn't say I knew that the train left. I just said the train left at 3:10. What are you complaining about? I mean, I didn't mislead you. But I think I did mislead you by the standards of everyday communicative practice. So anyway, let's just look at the Hinge passages. Maybe I won't read them all out. One of the most striking features of 341, where the Hinge metaphor is introduced, is that it's generally not fully quoted. As usually people do it, ... The questions we raise and our doubts depend on the fact that some propositions are exempt from doubt, or as it were, like hinges on which those turn. And I've even seen people, I won't mention names, who don't even ... it. They capitalize the the questions, the T in questions gets capitalized, and the ... is missed out. So what are the missing words? The missing words are that is to say. That's this. So 341, where the hinge metaphor is introduced, is a gloss on 340. And in fact, 342 is a gloss on 341. That is to say, it belongs to the logic of our scientific investigations, that certain things are indeed not doubted. So that we have these stepwise clarifications. So what does 340 say? Well, it says this: we know with the same certainty with which we believe any mathematical proposition how the letters A and B are pronounced, what the colour of human blood is called, that other human beings have blood and call it blood. We know. Hinges are defined by Wittgenstein in so many words in terms of knowledge. And that's the fundamental thing I want to impress on you. Now, there are other passages I'm very well aware of that point in a different direction. But I want you to at least think about this, that it would be an extraordinary thing to do what he does here if he didn't really mean it. But when you start looking around, you realize this is not the first time that such things have been said. In fact, there are remarks like this all over the place, and they show that things that have the hinge status are much more extensive than the rather strange and truncated examples that are given in 340. So here's 288. I know not just that the earth existed long before my birth, but also that it is a large body, that this has been established, that I and the rest of mankind have forebears, that there are books about all this, that such books don't lie, etc., etc., etc. And I know all this. I believe it. This body of knowledge has been handed on to me, and I have no grounds for doubting it, but on the contrary, all kinds of confirmation. And why shouldn't I say that I know all this? Isn't that what one does say? And I take it that this question is rhetorical. Imagine telling people, well, I believe I have parents, but I don't really know that I do. Only a philosopher would say that. Okay. So something follows right away. If hinges are defined in terms of knowledge, then Parce, Crispin, Duncan Pritchard, et hoc genus omne, the hinge concept presupposes that we have knowledge, and therefore is not an answer to skepticism. It couldn't be. It couldn't be. Now, an objection I'm going to hear, so I'll just preempt it, and I'm only going to discuss one particular passage, but to give you a template for how I would deal with similar cases. Here's 151. It's that Moore, Wittgenstein says repeatedly that Moore does not know what he says he knows. There are many such passages. So here's 151, which is frequently quoted. I should like to say Moore does not know what he asserts he knows, but it stands fast for him, as for me, regarding it as absolutely solid, as part of our method of doubt and inquiry. But you've got to be careful here, and the one thing you mustn't do is what Julian Floyd calls drive-by quotation. Namely, pick these passages out of the context of the surrounding passages in which they occur. So notice the phrase, I should like to say. Wittgenstein is not enunciating a view here. He is expressing an attitude a reaction that one will naturally have to More's performance. And I think this is reminiscent of things that we find, say, in philosophical investigations. For example, where his attack on the private object and the private language argument leads people to say, oh, well, you're just a behaviorist. And the answer is no. That dilemma itself only arises from a false picture of what is going on. And I think this is what, if you look at the surrounding passages, there's a good case you can see is going on here. There's a similar thing where Wittgenstein says, and Danielle's keen on this, and Duncan Pritchard makes it absolutely central, that Hinge commitments are animal or visceral. Wittgenstein doesn't say that they're animal or visceral. He says something very like what he says here. He says, here I want to say that our beliefs are, as it were, something animal. Again, I think it's reaction to a certain over-intellectualization of knowledge, human knowledge. And of course, I mean, perhaps the best passage of all is the one, and I forget the number right now, but where he says, when you hear Moore say, here is one hand, you immediately understand all those who think this has been by no means settled. In other words, the paradox of Moore is that his very performance makes it seem as if there's a problem about everyday knowledge. And it produces a counter-reaction. No, you don't know. But that's not the view. The view is to see why people think that. Why we oscillate between views which neither of which, both of which in fact, are distortions of our ordinary ways of operating with epistemic concepts. So there's a very interesting passage at 406, I think, where Wittgenstein describes what he says is the target, and this is kind of interesting because, of course, this recurs in another passage somewhere in the 500s, where he says that even if he hasn't got things right, people will recognize the target he was aiming at. And I think they haven't. But he says, what I'm aiming at is found in the difference between the passing remark, I know that's a such and such, as it might be used in ordinary life, and the same utterance when a philosopher makes it. That is, I feel, rightly, that these two mean something different. For when Moore says, I know that's a blah, 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 I want to reply, you don't know anything. And yet I would not say that to anyone who was speaking without philosophical intention. That's exactly what I said Wittgenstein thought, and we see him explaining it in so many words in 406, 407. Okay, so let me now move to slightly, this is really to motivate that there's a view here to consider which is generally not considered, except in the literature on uncertainty. I mean, from Morowitz and Strawson and onwards, the whole thought is that there are framework, or whatever you want to call them, commitments that lie apart from the route traveled by inquiry, etc., etc., and that because they understand, they shape what we understand by justification and so forth, cannot themselves, and doubt cannot themselves be subject to either. Now, so let's grant that hinge certainties shape what we understand by reasons or evidence. I don't think people really get their view of Wittgenstein from uncertainty, they bring to it something that he manifestly, or maybe not quite so manifestly, does not hold. So people say, because they are, as it were, they shape what we understand by reasons or evidence in the sense of our practice of doubting and then responding with reasons or evidence. They must themselves be groundless, and therefore they are not knowledge. And that's just a fallacy, I think. In my view, that is just a fallacy. Or more precisely, the argument goes through if you attribute to Wittgenstein the view that knowledge is justified through belief, where justification is itself understood in terms of the ability to provide reasons or evidence. Now, I think there's no evidence that Wittgenstein holds that view, no textual evidence whatsoever, none. More than that, I think we can see from Proposition 1 that this could not be his view. Because having laid down his agenda for criticizing more, he says, when one says that such and such a proposition can't be proved, of course, that does not mean that it can't be derived from other propositions. Any proposition can be derived from other propositions, but they may be no more certain than it is in itself. And then this curious remark by H. Newman. Some people think that Wittgenstein was influenced by Newman, and there are some passages in Newman that sound a bit like uncertainty, but it's completely wrong. Newman is a providentialist. He thinks that God has given us what he calls an illative sense. And people who think Newman is like Wittgenstein fail to read the epigraph, which I forget where it comes from, Tertullian or something. It's in Latin, maybe that's why. But it translates as something like, it has pleased God not to bring about the salvation of his people through dialectics. So presumably it's pleased God to bring it about some other way to appreciate the truth of the Bible via the illative sense, which is, of course, God has thoughtfully given you. Well, of course, Newman, of course, was the founder, one of the founders of the Oxford movement, the Anglo-Catholic movement, that eventually defected to Rome, became a cardinal, and of course, there's a well-known doctrine in Catholic theology, the gift of knowledge. So it's not surprising that Newman should have such a view. Okay, so look, if some things are such that they're already at the outer limits of certainty, then of course they can't be proved. You could deduce them from other propositions, yeah, why not? But this isn't going to help. Because they're already as certain as things get to be. And I think this is Wittgenstein's fundamental idea, but now note too, from it seeming to me or to everyone to be so, it doesn't follow that it is so. That, I think, is a repudiation of the central tenet of Hinge epistemology. Because in the end, if these are just animal or acculturated or whatever it is, they are shared seemings. That's what they are. This is how it strikes me. I can't help it. But Wittgenstein says, at two, it doesn't follow that they are so. From this. But then he raises a question, which I think is the truly brilliant move. What we can ask is whether it makes sense to doubt it. I think this is a revolutionary reversal of traditional epistemic foundationalism. Traditional foundationalists think there are privileged representations, propositions with a kind of special epistemic glow, such that if you, that in fact have a meaning to truth connection. That's to say, if you understand them, then you see, then you see that they must be true. There's a meaning to truth connection. The classic example, of course, at the time Wittgenstein was writing, particularly in the 30s, was sense datum propositions. You cannot have a false sense, datum, belief. You can misspeak, a slip of the tongue, as my teacher A.J.A. used to write. And it was our experience, having been taught by A.J.A. and Richard Rorty, which was something of a contrast. At least I knew what the myth of the given was, of course, when Rorty introduced me to Selma, since I'd been brought up in its shadow. Indeed, to believe it was not a myth. It's the other way around. It's doubt that cannot always be sensibly entered. Certainty lives, objective certainty, primitive certainty lives, where we cannot make sense of doubting a proposition. But this is where I think, for later things like the Earth has existed many years past, this is where the holistic and coherentist elements in uncertainty really make their importance felt. To doubt some of these things would be very, very difficult, because you'd have to explain how you were going to do without or get away from all other kinds of things that are involved in the system of belief in which your fundamental everyday and inherited scientific knowledge exists. As Wittgenstein says, some things are foundations, but only because they support walls. Foundations wouldn't be foundations if no walls are ever put up on them. They'd just be a peculiar row of bricks in the ground or something, serving no apparent purpose. So I think, actually, Wittgenstein, although I think Meredith's pressed this on me, and I think she might be right, there's a sense in which Wittgenstein is not terribly interested in knowledge. Or the analysis of knowledge, as we might think of it today. But I think he's a kind of infallibilist. That's to say, he thinks you know when you couldn't have made a mistake. Not couldn't have said something false, but as he himself explains, if you did say something false in circumstances like this, the question would arise as to whether we really understood what you were saying, or even whether you understood what you're saying. So if someone who's lived at a certain address for many years, and blah, 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 suddenly starts saying, no, I don't live there, I'm not a college professor, whatever, this wouldn't be a mistake, says Wittgenstein, it would be a mental disturbance, perhaps of a transient kind. But the big thing is that whether doubt makes sense, and this is where I think this talk of propositions is really, really dangerous. Wittgenstein's notion of propositions and uncertainty is much closer to Austin's notion of statements in his paper on truth. They are things that people say, or would agree with, or would act upon in definite situations, which includes many things. It includes many things. It includes, in some cases, particularly in cases of observational knowledge, the physical situation. But it also includes background knowledge, the inherited knowledge that we bring with us to the new situations that we encounter. So this is a notion, I used to call myself contextualist. I stopped because that notion was hijacked by what I think is a silly view of attributive contextualism. So I dropped the word contextually dependent. I now say situation dependent. Charles Travis defends this view too. And I'm influenced by Charles, and I'm the first to admit. He calls it occasion sensitivity. Things are said in a place at a time, and indeed to a person. I mean, the notion of evidence is person relative. I mean, when I show up at the TSA stand and show them my passport, that is evidence for them that I am the person whose name appears on the boarding pass. It's certainly, by the standards of Proposition 1 in uncertainty, it's not evidence for me that I am the person whose name appears on the boarding pass. I suppose, you know, if you get knocked on the head and have amnesia, you might start taking a look at your driver's license to see who you are, but this would be a very peculiar thing to do. Normally people don't do this. Now, I think that this is true about here is one hand. Yeah, okay. 1 minute? Okay, here is one hand. When Moore does this with the gesture, if I'm uncertain as to whether Moore has held up his hand, there needs to be some reason. Doubts need grounds, as Wittgenstein tells us. And by the way, fairy tales don't count, so don't tell me about brains in vats, because I'm going to say, let's be serious. Brains in vats are on a par with Sleeping Beauty. They are not skeptical hypotheses. They are skeptical fairy tales, which is some terminology I would like to, in thin science fiction garb. I mean, when people bring this up, I want to say, give me a break. You know why I'm not being deceived by an evil demon? There aren't any. Adam Leiter once said to me, if there's one thing we discovered in the 17th century, it's that the evil demons don't exist. And therefore I couldn't be deceived by one. Okay, well, this is groundless knowledge, though. It's not knowledge that has evidence. It couldn't, because nothing is more certain than it. But, as Hanyo was saying the other day, it's the exercise of a capacity. Learning to talk, in fact. Learning what in English we call a hand, or call a dog, or call a cat. It's the kind of thing that one, in perception, we see what is there to be seen, and we make of it what we've learned to make of it, or what we can make of it, or do make of it. And we exercise these acquired capacities. That's how we do it. There are no grounds or evidence, and by the standards of Proposition 1, there could not be. But that doesn't stop them from being knowledge. They're knowledge because the notion of doubt gets no grip. Okay, if you want to know what Moore's real mistake is, I'll tell you in Q&A. I'll stop now.